being pro-choice, NARAL was created in 1973. Now, Betty Friedan was very much a strong part of the National Women's Conference, and I'll talk about that a little later. In her book, The Second Stage, she kind of modified some of her more radical beliefs. And she wrote her autobiography in 2000, Life So Far. Jane, next slide. So Betty Friedan, I think, pretty much created the women's movement. Now, Pauli Murray was also, Gloria Steinem, can't forget her, major player. She entered the women's movement right around 1971. She co-founded Ms. Magazine. She also was another co-creator of the National Women's Political Caucus. And she wrote several books. I don't know how many of you were able to attend her event when she came to San Diego in 2019 with her latest book titled, The Truth Will Set You Free, but First It Will Piss You Off. Gloria Steinem. Anyway, it was a sold out event here in San Diego. It was just a lot of fun to be able to see her in person and then even have your picture taken with her. That was a lot of fun. Anyway, Gloria Steinem has been an amazing force for the women's movement. She's creating right now a women's place in New York City. She and some of her colleagues were able to take over an old women's prison. And so she's continuing to fight for women's rights and women's opportunities. Okay, next slide. So as I mentioned a little bit ago, I talked about Pauli Murray. She managed to get a good education. She graduated from Howard and really became super involved in the law situation. And she was also very much a part of President Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women. So she helped found the National Organization for Women, which was an outgrowth of that commission. She's a poet. She was a poet. And then later in life, after she received her doctorate degree in juris science, wasn't a JD, she decided that she really wanted to become an Episcopal priest, so she went to the seminary. She was the first African-American woman to become a priest. She was a very good friend of Eleanor Roosevelt's, and between the two of them, they wrote 300 letters to each other. Who has the time? I mean, here was a woman who was teaching, she was becoming a priest, and she and Eleanor Roosevelt are communicating to the tune of 300 letters. Okay, next slide. All these women were so dedicated to promoting feminism and the end of oppression, and Kate Millett was one of those. She became the head of the Education Committee for the National Organization for Women, and she wrote about the differences in the education women get compared to the education men get. So she sent out a major alert to all women's colleges to beef up. It's sort of like having AAUW there, beefing up what's offered to women. We need more women in STEM. So Kate Millett pretty much was in the forefront of that particular issue. She wrote the book, Sexual Politics, and she said that all power lies in the hands of men. And we women have to do what we can to take it away from them. She wrote 2 autobiographies and was really a powerhouse in the women's movement. Next slide. Okay, I've also incorporated some of the women, the feminist women who were serving women back in Washington. And one of those women was Edith Green. And when she was in high school, she told her teacher she wanted to go to college to become an engineer. And she was told, no, no, no. Girls become school teachers. They don't become engineers. So Edith Green became a teacher. And after a while, she wasn't happy with the fact that she was making less money than her male counterparts. So she decided to run for office, and she was elected. And one of her key issues was equal pay. And it took her 8 years, but finally Congress passed the Equal Pay Act of 1963. It took her 8 years working on that. And she was always fighting for women professors to make equal pay with their male counterparts. And so she was called the mother of higher education. And she was a member of AAUW, of course. She also was very active in working on Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and also Title IX. Next slide. Now, another important feminist was Dolores Huerta. And I don't know how many of you have heard her speak, but she's still a dynamite speaker. And she's very much in the forefront of pushing for equal rights. And she really was I really think she was the force behind creating the United Farm Workers Union in 1962. Everybody gives Cesar Chavez credit, but Dolores is still a powerhouse and still working for women's rights. She really wants more women to run for elected office. Somebody mentioned earlier that we've made some pretty good progress in that area. We're now up to 27.4% in our House of Representatives, women, 27.4%. In our US Senate, it's 24%. Last year when Kamala Harris was the senator, we were at 25. So we need some major work getting more women elected to office. Okay, next slide. Okay, another woman representing us back in Washington was a woman named Martha Griffiths. Now, she wanted to be an attorney, as did her husband, and they both applied for Harvard Law School, and Harvard accepted him and refused her. So they went to law school in Michigan, and she eventually became a member of the House of Representatives. Now, one of her key issues was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And Title VII pertains to discrimination in education or on the job. And she looked at Title VII and it said you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, or country of your origin, your national origin. So she said, what's missing from the Civil Rights Act of 1964? What's missing in Title VII? She said, we need to add the word sex or gender. And when this was proposed, when she proposed this on the floor of Congress, she was laughed at. What? Why would you even think that there would be discrimination against women? Impossible. Well, it was finally added and it was approved. And thanks to Martha, we have it in our Civil Rights Act of 1964. She also, and in this picture here, she's presenting the Equal Rights Amendment outside the Capitol in 1972. Next slide. Also, during this era, Roe v. Wade was enacted or passed through our Supreme Court. So this occurred January 22nd, 1973. And what I think is fascinating about Linda's photograph is all of the textbooks she has in front of her. How many of us do any research in that type of mode? Anyway, this Roe v. Wade has been attacked and attacked state after state after state. I tried to determine how many actual bills have been passed restricting Roe v. Wade, and I think it's close to 500 across all of our states. It's just unbelievable how much effort has gone into whittling away Roe v. Wade. Okay, next slide. So this was an important issue for women of the second wave, whether they were elected to office, working in the community, writing. And most of the women that I'm talking about today were phenomenally productive when it comes to writing. And Alice Walker is one of those. I tried to tabulate how many books she's written, and I got to over 40 books. And I read somewhere that she had written 60. So I still don't know. But here is a woman who continues to be very productive, sharing her views about the rights of women, the issues of how we can really become truly equal across all ethnicities, races, and between the two sexes. She also wrote The Color Purple, winning a Pulitzer Prize for that. It became a very popular movie with Oprah Winfrey. Now, she didn't call herself a feminist. She called herself a womanist. And that's a feminist, but it's a woman of color. So she was really promoting womanism and continues to be a prolific writer. Next slide. Patsy Mink, another elected official. She wanted to become a doctor, and when she graduated from college, she applied to 20 schools. She was turned down by 20 schools. She then shifted gears, enrolled at the University of Chicago in their School of Law. She became an attorney. She went back to Hawaii and she applied to become a member of various law firms. She was turned down by every single one. She created her own law firm. And then she decided that she was going to become a member of the House of Representatives after she served as a state senator. She was elected twice to the House of Representatives, and she became very involved in the educational amendments. Her baby was Title IX. We, in our school systems, especially if they're federally funded, cannot spend more money on boys than they do on girls. It has to be equal proportionately. So this was her key push, this Title IX. And it is part of our law now. And some schools have been fined because they do spend more money on boys than they do on girls. And you just can't do that. Now, everybody thinks this is related primarily to sports, but it's not just sports. It's anything related to how the funding is distributed. And so as a result of Title IX, we're seeing more and more girls getting scholarships, scholarships to college. And it's just been a phenomenal strength as far as getting girls into college and making it possible for so many of them to go to college. Now, after Patsy Mink died, the educational amendments was changed to the Patsy Mink educational amendments. She too was another powerhouse pushing for women's rights and opportunities. Next slide. Robin Morgan, she actually was a child actor. She was in a program on television. I didn't find what the name of that program was, but she was a radical feminist, and she believed that the word radical really comes from rooting out. We have to get rid of something. And so her sense was and that oppression can branch into earlier into sexism, racism, you name it. So she was a staunch believer in being a radical feminist, rooting out this oppression against women. Now, in 1970, she created an anthology titled Sisterhood is Powerful, and she invited every feminist she knew to contribute to her anthology. It became a bestseller, and it really raised the ire of men who were exposed to it. She was an editor for Ms. Magazine. She founded a couple of radical groups, the Red Stockings and Witch. She also cautioned all of us to become more and more involved with promoting women's rights and women's opportunities. She and Gloria Steinem and Jane Fonda created the Women's Media Center. So she's very involved in continuing that effort to get women portrayed the way they should be portrayed throughout the media. Okay, next slide. Shuli Firestone and Joe Freeman actually created the term the Women's Liberation Movement. Now, this was quite an amazing statement to bring forward. But the two of them were at a kind of, well, what is this all about? And so they said, well, it's really an effort to liberate women. So it became known as the Women's Liberation Movement of the second wave. Now, Shuli was extremely radical, and she didn't even believe that women should have to have babies. Let's create some system where women wouldn't have to have a baby. They could just turn the embryo over to some magical compartment or whatever, and the baby would be created. She was truly, truly, truly radical. And when the women's liberation movement first started, she published the first year, 1968, and of course, publishing the notes from the second year, 1970 and 1971. Really an amazing, amazing woman. Okay, next slide. Now, I've included Judy Baca because at the museum, we have 3 panels. And the 3 panels are the first wave, the second wave, and the third wave. Now, these panels are outside the museum. The museum is still closed, even though our gift shop is open. So you can look at these three panels of the waves of feminism. And so the first wave pertains to the suffrage movement. And then the second wave is what we're talking about today. And it includes Judy Baca from Los Angeles. And I had never heard of Judy Baca until I saw this panel outside the museum. Now, she is a phenomenal muralist. She created the largest mural in the world, and it's called the Great Wall of Los Angeles. And she had 400 people creating this mural about all of our rights and all of the issues related to what's going on with men and women. So she's been quite the feminist, promoting and creating more and more murals. She created the Social and Political Art Revolution Center. That's not the quite term. So she does have an art center in Los Angeles also. And I'm determined to get up to LA because I need to walk that Great Wall of Los Angeles and really see what it's all about. Next slide. So our next feminist is Shirley Chisholm. And the reason I included her was, as we all know, childcare is a major issue for women. And I have a friend who works at UC San Diego, and she has a little girl, and she pays almost $2,000 a month for childcare for her little one. This is a little bit unacceptable to my way of thinking. Anyway, back in 1972, Shirley and Bella Abzug created the Comprehensive Child Development Bill. And they worked on that and promoted it. It was for federally funded child care programs throughout the country. What could be better? And so it was finally passed in the House of Representatives. It went to the Senate. It was passed in the Senate. Everybody serving in the House and in the Senate believed this was important. The bill went to Richard Nixon's desk. His speechwriters wrote up two different speeches. One if he accepted and signed off on the Comprehensive Child Development Bill, and the other was if he vetoed it. Well, he vetoed it. And his reasoning was that, well, if we have this comprehensive child development bill for all of our babies here in this country, we'll be Sovietizing all of our precious little ones. Well, can you imagine? What an outrageous thing. But that was during the Cold War. Anyway, I can't tell you how Shirley and Bella Abzug were just devastated. Next slide. And here we have a picture of Bella Abzug. And she was quite the promoter. She was the co-founder of the National Women's Political Caucus, along with Patty Murray and Betty Friedan. Well, Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't involved in creating it. But anyway, Bella Abzug also worked on that Comprehensive Child Development Bill that I just talked about that failed. Thank you, Richard Nixon. We're still in need of having federally funded childcare. And she created the Women's Equality Day, which we celebrate every year, August 26th. And of course, last year was a big year. We celebrated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which was the culmination of the first wave of feminism. Okay, next slide. Joe Freeman worked with Shuli Firestone, and between the two of them, they did create the term the Women's Liberation Movement. I don't know how many times I was asked back in the 1970s, are you one of those women libbers? I don't know how many times I was asked that. But anyway, they created that term, the Women's Liberation Movement. Now, one of Joe's major books was the Bitch Manifesto, and she said we all need to look into ourselves and pull out that inner bitch and let it develop and grow and be a force. And I thought, well, that's interesting. She was the voice of the women's liberation movement, which became a pretty popular book, but her more popular book was The Politics of the Women's Liberation. Now, she had not only a PhD, but she also had a JD. So she, was a true academic, getting as many major degrees as she could, I guess. She wrote an interesting book titled Trashing. And this book was about how women sometimes have a tendency not to support other women. And I think this is an issue that she experienced, and some other women have certainly experienced it. And she was trying to say in this book, come on, women, let's stop it. Let's unite, work together. Come on, we can all find a common ground. Let's do it. So I applaud her for that. She was very active in the National Organization for Women and worked on creating now in New York, the state of New York. She also was very active in the National Women's Conference in 1977. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So remember Joe Freeman. Okay, next slide. I mentioned in the beginning that Bell Hooks was the one who created the definition of feminism. And it's the end of sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. That's the definition of feminism. We need to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. Now, she's quite the poet and has created many, many books. I believe she's had at least 20 or 30 books published. All of these women were phenomenal writers, very prolific. Okay, next slide. And let's see. Cynthia Enloe. Now, I included her, even though she came pretty much toward the end of the second wave, which ended in about 1980. But she was concerned about women's treatment and women's rights in the military. And I had done a lot of research for the federal government on women in the military. So I was really engrossed in anything Cynthia wrote, and I cited her in most of my publications. So she was really promoting how do women have equal rights and opportunities in the military? But then again, she was pretty much against militarization of just about everything. So I could embrace that along with her. Okay, next slide. I mentioned the National Women's Conference, which was held in 1977. Now, Bella Abzug promoted this back in the early 1970s, and it just so happened that it was approved. And it was decided that $5 million would be set aside for this National Women's Conference. And delegates from all over the country were asked to create, well, what are the issues of importance to women to be held in 1977? One of the key issues was women wanted to have credit, their own credit, which Sherry mentioned that at the Commission on the Status of Women. It wasn't easy to get credit in the early 1970s. Even if you were married, you had to have somebody sign with you like a man. Anyway, at this conference, they created 26 different planks, issues of importance to all women. And as you can see, it covered a few years because Rosalind Carter was the first lady at that time, but Betty Ford had before her, and also Lady Bird Johnson. And Lady Bird is standing next to her daughter. And next to the daughter is Maya Angelou. And Maya Angelou was asked to create a declaration of sentiments pertaining to the 1970s. As I mentioned early in my presentation, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had created a declaration of sentiments in 1848. And so this was to be an update on that Declaration of Sentiments. So from 1848 to 1977, Maya Angelou wrote another Declaration of Sentiments. And that was carried from Seneca Falls to Houston, where this conference was held. And it cited all of the sentiments that are important to women, and they need to be addressed. And so that's what the conference was all about, talking about 26 different issues. Now, at the conclusion of that conference, it was stated that there will be a second National Women's Conference. And I thought, I wonder if there was one. So I wrote to Jo Freeman. I just mentioned her name a few minutes ago. I happened to find her by Googling her. I wrote her a note and I said, has there been a second National Women's Conference? And she wrote back and said, no. She said, we did have a 40th anniversary in 2017. Is my math good? Is that 40 years? Anyway, so in 2017, there was another conference in Houston where they discussed, what's happened in those 40 years. Still a lot of work to do. So what I think I'll do is I'll probably write to Jo Freeman again and ask her if she's up to promoting the second National Women's Conference, because we really need to look at what are we still in need of. So let's look at the next slide. Okay, so how have we been doing since the second wave of feminism? Well, we still have sexism, we still have patriarchy, racism, ageism, blah, blah, blah. Reproductive rights, we're terrified that our Supreme Court might just scrap it. How can they do that to women? And the Equal Rights Amendment. It doesn't look as though we're going to get that in our Constitution, and I thought we would with the change in the election. But it looks like even though we've met the 38 state ratification, and the three last states, Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia, all had their attorney generals say, okay, we can go ahead, let's push this through, let's get it in our Constitution. And today, as I said in the paper, an attorney said, nope, he dismissed it. It's not going to be addressed in his court. And one of the attorney generals said, I'm going to appeal this. We're not going to sit still and let this not be added. Okay, and how are we doing with equal pay for equal work? Well, we made some progress there, but not enough. And it just so happens Iceland has added to its constitution that companies cannot pay men and women differently in the same job. And companies are responsible for making sure that women receive the same pay as men in whatever that position or that category is. The European Union is addressing that situation now. They want it so that all employees will know, well, how do I compare with others in this same job? And I'm sure a lot of us here today have gone through that, where we've had to fight to get equal pay, but eventually we won't have to do that. And of course, we need equal representation in elected office. It would just be unbelievably wonderful if 2 or 3 of you in our gathering today would say, you know, I'm going to run for office. Wouldn't that be wonderful? We just need more people to do that. People like Melissa. Melissa here should be being groomed to run for office. And if I can help in any way, I'm available, Melissa. So let me know when you're ready and we'll promote you. Okay, so I'm pretty much out of time. And if you have any questions or comments or concerns, let me know. And maybe we have a few minutes to talk about those. Jane?
Sure. Any questions?
Did you see this, what Melissa said? She says, sounds great. I'm game. Yay.
All right, Melissa. Yeah, we're happy to have her in AAW.
We have witnesses, Melissa. How wonderful.
Yeah, just let me know when you're ready to get started.
I don't know if you're old enough
Oh,
yet.
isn't that great?
I'll be 28 in May, so.
Oh, I thought you were 20. Okay. Everybody looks young to
Okay,
me.
we're gonna work on that, Melissa.
That sounds good.
Sarah Jacobs is what, 31 or 32?
Yep, and she's in
the House.
she's in my district, and I voted for her too.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we'll figure something out here.
I did look up Robin. Was that her name, Morgan? She was in a show called Mama, which apparently
Yes,
ran.
Robin.
It's called Mama, and it ran in the 50s. It said she played Dagmar or something like that, maybe a daughter. She was in 153 episodes. I don't remember that show.
Wow.
And then I also, while you're talking, I looked up The Wall because I wanted to see some examples. So some of you might want to do that on your computer pad. The Wall, Great Wall of Los Angeles, beautiful.
Or if we can ever take a group trip with when COVID's done, we'll do that.
Yeah, go up on the train maybe.
I'd like that a lot.
You know, when COVID's over with, or you feel comfortable enough, we do a group trip.
Right.
Sounds great.
I'm game for that.
I am too.
So, and
I
you
would
were,
love that.
and you've attended some of these conferences, all right? Didn't you go to the China one?
Yes, I went to the 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995. So last year was a big year, And at the United Nations, we were to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women. And we had such a delightful time in Beijing. Hillary Rodham Clinton headed up the US government delegation. And I, of course, was a part of the non-governmental organization segment of that conference. But my friend Dee Aker and I both had press passes, so we managed somehow to become part of Hillary's entourage. I mean, everybody was either a member of the press or what have you. And I remember Dee and I walking, right along with the entourage into the main building, the government building. And we were able to hear Hillary speak. And that's where she gave her famous speech about human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. And everywhere she went, people just started chanting, Hillary, Hillary, Hillary. It was amazing. The adoration she had throughout the world. There were 40,000 of us in Beijing for the Fourth World Conference on Women. And President Clinton really embraced that conference too. And he created the Interagency Council on Women. And all of the federal agencies and departments had to adhere to what came out of that Fourth World Conference on Women. A platform for action was signed off by 189 countries. And all of these countries agreed that they would work on actions in 12 critical areas of concern. From women getting elected to office, such as Melissa, women in education, health, violence against women, 12 critical areas of concern. And President Clinton said, I want all of you agencies to look at that book and identify what actions pertain to your agency or department. And you will report back to me every 2 months. And so this gathering, this Interagency Council on Women, met every 2 months and reported on what they had accomplished. And so in a way, this was the beginning of the third wave of feminism. Unfortunately, in 2000, George W. Bush was elected president, and the first thing he did was to shut down the Interagency Council on Women. Unbelievable. So it was a heady time. Those of us who went to the Fourth World Conference on Women, when we came back, there were about 25 to 30 of us from San Diego. We were honored at a cocktail party at the Hilton by Murray Gallinson. And he invited Bella Abzug to come out and speak at that gathering. And we felt like we were rock stars, the way we were treated coming back from that conference, and then being honored by Murray Gallinson at this cocktail party. Whoa. Well, as we all know, things like that don't last long. But anyway, it was a lot of fun while it lasted.
One thing, like last week, I forgot to ask if it was okay to record this. I had started recording it. Is it okay with you, Anne, that I recorded it?
Of course, of course.
Okay, it starts a little late like last week. I get busy letting people in, then I forget to hit record. So anyway, we'll put it up on the website later. I'll have Shauna help me with that. So, our Shauna does a lot of stuff. Oh, Yolanda has a question.
Yes, I particularly was very interested. I'm retired military, and I'm particularly interested in Cynthia Enloe and her books. I'm going to look them up and read them. I may even write to her because she's still alive. And I was going to mention that I have a lot of background in this, being in the military. I always, they complained, a lot of sexual harassment in the military. Well, I never had anything to do with sexual harassment ever. However, I felt gender harassment. They just dismissed some of my ideas because I was a woman. I was the only female officer in the unit, and my ideas were not important to them because I wasn't a guy. And a lot of times, you could see that in other situations. So I'm interested in looking at what she wrote and I'm glad you put her in there. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your comments. It's kind of interesting. I worked as a research psychologist for the federal government, and I was always asked to have more and more collateral duties. So one of my collateral duties was to become an instructor of prevention of sexual harassment in the workplace. And so I never experienced any sexual harassment, but who would harass somebody who was a certified instructor of prevention of sexual harassment? So I do remember going into one scientist's office, and he had Playboy bunnies decorating his whole office. And I said, Jerry, those have got to come down. We're trying to create professional offices throughout the federal government. Take them down. What? Anyway, he did. But so, it was a pretty serious thing back in the 80s and 90s when I was working as such.
But I don't know if you saw the documentary, The Invisible War, Kirby Dick, and that is, Yolanda, you might be interested. It's about harassment in the military, not just harassment, too, rape. And he came and spoke at one of our state conventions, AAUW, and I wrote down a quote from him. He said, AAUW members are the stormtroopers of justice. We were always,
I like that.
yeah.
That's
So
wonderful.
yeah, I never can remember the name of that movie, so I just looked it up. Yeah, it's The Invisible War.
By whom? Who did that documentary?
Kirby, Kirby Dick, D-I-C-K.
Okay.
He's I would call him a feminist. He does documentaries about women and sexism and things, so worth looking into.
Well, you see it in not just the military, you see it so much. And again, I luckily, I have never been a victim of sexual harassment. I've been more of gender. The same thing when I was doing my my student teaching. I was pregnant with my son, Paul. He was born in 73, in the fall of 73. I was going spring semester doing my student teaching, and they told me at that school, this is 73, they told me in my school that I could not do student teaching when I started showing that I was pregnant. And I asked, do these kids here, I was middle school. I said, do these kids not know where babies come from? Maybe we should teach them, show them a pregnant woman. But, my son was born in October and this was in spring, so I wasn't showing. But that was the situation back then.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't show. You couldn't show people that you were pregnant, you were a woman.
What's interesting is we had an AAUW member who was working right after World War II, and her husband was going to college on the GI Bill. And she was working in a laboratory. And when she became pregnant, she was told she had to leave. And she said, well, I can't leave. I'm the sole breadwinner in the family and I need to work.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we're sorry. You just can't continue working. And she said, I'm sorry. I have to continue working. And they finally agreed that she could, but she'd have to continue wearing a lab coat.
Yeah, well, that
To
happened to me
cover-
also in the military when I was in the Navy.
Yeah.
I had, the minute they knew I was pregnant, I had to resign. Not just, take a leave or anything, resign my commission
Mhm.
and leave. And because I guess they wanted you barefoot and pregnant at home. And I went and decided to go back in after I had my son 3 years later. And they let me in the reserves because they had changed the policy. I was just a little too early before the policy was changed. But that was that way too.
Yeah.
And I think it happens in other professions too, like you said.
Mhm. Well, when I was in high school in the 60s, girls who got pregnant in my class or high school, they just kicked them out of school. Those
Yeah.
are they needed the education. They're afraid that I guess the rest of us would say, oh, she's pregnant. I want to go out and get pregnant too, So, yeah, things were bad, even in the 70s, like you were talking about, and you couldn't get a credit card. One lady I know posted on Facebook the other day that she's a couple years older than I am. She got a divorce and wanted to get a credit card, and her father had to sign for her. They wouldn't let her get her own credit card, even though she'd been married and she was working. And as a matter of fact, she was a singer on Andy Williams' show. So
Yeah. When was this? What year?
70s. I don't know exactly,
Mhm.
but in the 70s.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you everybody for coming in. What a wonderful program. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
And we'll post it on the website if you want to